In 1802, an English artist left his wife and children in Dublin and took a passage to India, embarking on a journey from which he'd never return. A sociable man, renowned for his humour, eccentric behaviour, sense of theatre, and his capacity for eating, a lone figure faced with mounting debts, who sought solace in his love of drawing and the details of everyday life in the Far East. A man who boasted that he was the ugliest man on the China coast. This was to be the final destination of the most accomplished and influential of 19th century Western artists in the Far East.
Macau sits at the southern edge of China's mighty Pearl River Delta, and it was here that the Portuguese traders came, followed by other Europeans and Americans, to trade at Canton, some 65 miles upstream.
For hundreds of years, Macau was a stepping stone to China, a small Portuguese enclave, which became an entrepot, trading with several eastern ports and above all with China, the major source of tea, silk, and porcelain. George Chinnery arrived here from India on the 29th of September 1825. He was already 51 years old, but he lived on in Macau for another 27 years, as witness to the First Opium War, the establishment of Hong Kong, and the arrival of photography.
George Chinnery is best known for two things. He made his name in Calcutta as a portrait painter, because for a European artist at that time, that's where the money was.
In fact, it was regarded as an upward step in one's social progress to have one's portrait painted by George Chinnery.
But what he preferred was painting and drawing landscape, and in Macau that meant being an urban landscape artist.
He mastered the art of drawing ordinary people involved in their everyday activities. Works of art by any artist during the China trade years are interesting because they record history, a new era in the making. And George Chinnery was without doubt the most significant Western artist of that time and place. And he's left an extraordinary record not only of the personalities, but also the everyday life of Macau in the early 19th century. Chinnery left a very special legacy of views of Macau, including one of his sketchbooks which is now on loan to the Macau Museum of Art. He created a visual diary of life on the China coast, vivid mementos of a place that was already changing rapidly, and of which the West was becoming ever more aware. Scenes that were sent home around the world, postcards if you like, souvenirs of the China trade years.
This sketchbook is an excellent example of how Chinnery worked and why he became so popular.
Chinnery used his sketches as raw material for finished ink drawings and watercolors and oil paintings. He'd learned to write in shorthand from his father, a professional shorthand writer. And when translated, this shorthand often shows what Chinnery thought of the sketch. He might say, fully to be relied on, or he might say, incorrect, left leg too long. Sketched figures often reappear in his paintings. Here, for example, a group of men drawn hauling up water by San Lorenzo reappears in an oil painting of the same scene. On this page, he's roughly sketched a bird's eye view over the rooftops of Macau, first in pencil outline and then below in ink and watercolor. And later, he incorporates the same view into an oil painting.
He became almost obsessive about his sketching.
For example, you sometimes see several sketches of the same figure. Here, Chinnery draws several sketches of a Chinese man with his hands held behind him, as he's trying to work out exactly how the one hand grasps the other wrist. A little shorthand cross next to the sketch indicates that he's satisfied with the result.
Chinnery was happy to joke about his debts or his wife or his own appearance, but when it came to his art or his reputation, he took himself very seriously indeed.
In 1838, he wrote to one of his patrons, the merchant James Matheson.
This will be the sketchbook of a painter, and some 50 years hence may be interesting. Here and there I'll leave one drawing in an unfinished state, that GC may be seen more clearly, when it may come under the eye of a brother of the pencil.
Chinnery became very skillful at capturing the stance of figures, the way they sit or lean forward in one way or another. In just a few lines, he establishes the balance of a group of figures, and his shorthand notes show his concern to get it absolutely right. He built up a whole treasury of sketches that he could then refer to later as he created more finished pen and ink drawings or watercolors, or occasionally oil paintings. First, he made rough pencil sketches, up to 7 before breakfast, adding the shorthand notes. Then, he'd rework his drawings in pen and ink, rubbing out the pencil shorthand. At that time, if you wanted to bring back a souvenir from the Far East, you bring back an entire Chinnery sketchbook, Sketches of Macau. And many of the places he depicted are still here. In the opinion of his friend Gideon Nye, Chinnery's genius and greatest delight was his sketching of scenery with groups of Chinese people in and around Macau, in what Nye described as the poetry of life.
And that poetry of life is still very much in evidence here in the back streets around Senado Square, which is the historic center of Macau.
In addition to the barbers who had attracted his attention, Chinnery's subjects include vendors of vegetables or sweets, fortune tellers, beggars, and groups of figures eating at food stalls. Then, as now, games of chance and skill were often in evidence. Fantan, dice, cards, or jianxi, or shuttlecock played with the feet. If there's one figure that epitomizes Chinnery's art, it's the blacksmith, hammering and pumping the wooden bellows to fan a charcoal fire. Often, a very large bamboo umbrella provided shelter for the operator and his fire. Here we see his fondness for vermilion, the bright red pigment derived from the mineral cinnabar, which the Chinese had already been using for some 800 years. It's seen here in the blacksmith's hat and his pursed lips and the glowing embers of his charcoal fire.
Now, Chinnery used this church as a backdrop in dozens of his drawings.
It's all happening by the church railings, with a Baroque column just coming into view. But it's the market activity that really interests him. But never, as far as I know, does he ever stand right in front of it and make a formal, straight-on picture of it. Along with people going about their daily tasks, Chinnery also loved sketching animals, including huge pot-bellied Asian pigs with dark backs and pink stomachs close to the ground, and short legs and tail, a fleshier creature than its western cousin. He also depicted goats and chickens and dogs and cattle.
And we're further back in Senado Square now, and from here in Chinnery's day, you could see right round the curve to San Domingo's church, and then up on the hill behind is the big central fort.
Chinnery completed several sketches here at the site of the Casa de Misericordia, which was an orphanage and the first Western clinic in China. They show the church and then the battlements of Fort Monte on the hill with the old defensive wall climbing up towards it. The scene today is a far cry from Macau in the 19th century. The figures in Chinnery's street scenes are largely Chinese, but sometimes pairs of Macanese women are also to be seen, with a servant holding an umbrella up behind them. In 1826, Chinnery took a short lease on a house in Macau. He was obliged to rent, as no Westerners other than Portuguese were allowed to own property in Macau. His lodgings were near the Church of San Lorenzo. In these narrow streets, people come and go, and vendors sell their wares. There's nothing glamorous. What you see is what you get. It's a local Chinese part of town with a small street market and cooked food vendors.
Now this is where Chinnery lived, down behind the church of San Lorenzo. And the actual house is number 8, Rua de Ignacio Batista, and the street still survives, although Chinnery's house and the others have long since been replaced. However, the very next street has been named Rua de George Chinnery.
Peeling plaster and mildew might not look very impressive in modern times, but to Chinnery, that's what helped to make the picture.
Some of these houses must have looked very much the same in Chinnery's day.
Chinnery often painted these steps leading up to the church of San Lorenzo. By way of foreground action, he adds workers hoisting a bucket to the platform above.
If you look at Chinnery's pictures of this spectacular church, you'll notice that he hardly includes the church itself. He's more interested in the activity in front of it. We're very close here to where Chinnery lived, and he must have walked past this gateway 1,000 times.
Built in the 18th century, St. Joseph's Seminary and Chapel are rather splendid buildings in the Baroque style. I doubt that he spent much time inside these churches, but he certainly appreciated their design.
This is a wonderful piece of architecture.
Can you imagine walking into a church like this for the first time? But the religious motifs were not likely to have appealed to Chinnery. His mind was focused on what he discovered outdoors rather than on his immortal soul. Not far from Chinnery's old house is a site that receives a great many visitors today and was clearly one of his favourite subjects.
The Alma Temple, scene of some of George Chinnery's most satisfying drawings and paintings.
Although he sometimes depicted the temple itself, in many of his works it's partly obscured by the rocks and the boats and the tall masts in front of the temple. It's such a distinctive complex of Chinese architecture with wonderful upswept roofs and moon gateways, surrounded by seafront, trees and rocks, quite unlike anything he'd been used to in England or in India. Chinese architecture, combined with natural forms, makes one of the classic views of Macau, and a perfect subject for George Chinnery.
Thankfully, it survives today, more or less as it was in Chinnery's time.
Another of the great features of Macau was the Praia Grande, or Great Bay. Along this spectacular bay were the headquarters of the East India Company and other spacious residences with columns and verandas, let by Portuguese to the Western merchants. Before Hong Kong was established as an English colony, Macau was the only place in China where foreign merchants and their families were allowed to live. The Praia Grande reminded early European visitors of the Bay of Naples, or bays in the south of France, and that was purely natural. But for Chinnery, it wasn't simply the likeness that appealed, it was the activity on the beach that he liked. Again, he didn't just want to paint the natural forms, he wanted to capture the everyday scenes occurring on the waterfront.
It was the combination of the sweeping bay and the foreground action that appealed to Chinnery.
In one of his works, a ship, an East Indiaman, can be seen framed in a rock arch on the extreme left. We often see long, deep shadows and early morning sunlight illuminating the elegant facades along the east-facing beach.
It may have been here that Chinnery encountered a photographer for the first and perhaps the only time. And this was Jules Itier, a French daguerreotypist who spent 10 weeks here in 1844. And in fact, his are the earliest surviving photographs of anywhere in China. And I'm quite sure that he and Chinnery would have taken the chance to compare notes.
Almost none of the buildings on the Praia Grande depicted by Chinnery survive today. There's only the former governor's house, which was built shortly before Chinnery died. It's been altered since then, but it gives some idea of the former glory of the place. Chinnery enjoyed depicting rocks, and the shoreline was an obvious place for Chinnery to sketch. This location has got everything that Chinnery looked for, with a view across the water to the distant hills. Chinnery liked evening and early morning light and the long shadows that cast over the foreground. And very often he added a touch of bright red, perhaps a cooking fire on a distant hillside, or wayside flowers, or the red scarf of a boatwoman. He also found something magical in the misty blue light of early morning, with junks at anchor on a still day with a thin veil of mist obscuring the hills behind. Or you see these wonderful cumulus clouds that you often get here in the summer months. Dark clouds and patches of sunshine lighting up part of the scene, leaving other details deep in shadow, and in the case of these watercolours, almost blurred out, even ghost-like in their half-finished state. The boatwomen, known in Chinnery's day as tanka boatwomen, occupy a special position in Chinnery's art. To a largely male expatriate community, the image of the boatwoman was a fertile symbol of the China coast. The Western merchants would often complain of their lack of contact with women, but the local women they did meet would probably be these boatwomen, who ferried them around the islands and out to their ships.
Chinnery paints these rather charming, coy young women with their welcoming smiles and blue and white tunics and bare feet, staring wistfully out at us.
The tanka people were so named after their egg-shaped boats, broad, rounded sampans with curved rattan roofs. They created makeshift dwellings by raising the boats on stones or wooden stilts. Chinnery often drew their families cooking and their clothes hung out to dry. In Chinnery's pictures, their faces often appear more Western than Chinese. Their hair was worn long, parted at the front and plaited at the back. By all accounts, the boatwomen smiled a good deal, and that's how Chinnery often depicts them.
Did Chinnery have a liaison with any of these women? After all, he did have 2 illegitimate children in India, and there's no doubt that some of the Western merchants in Macau did enjoy relationships with the boatwomen.
In Chinnery's case, we really can't be sure. Indeed, Chinnery was a long way from home. Born in 1774, George Chinnery was 17 when he exhibited his first picture, a miniature portrait, at the Royal Academy in London. He enrolled at the Royal Academy schools. Not long after, fellow artists William Blake and J.M.W. Turner. At the age of 22, he travelled to Ireland, and in 1800, he married Marianne Vine, his landlord's daughter. Then in 1802, he sailed to Madras, modern Chennai, in southern India, where his brother worked for the East India Company. But his wife and his 2 young children stayed behind in Ireland. It was another 16 years before his wife and daughter Matilda joined him in India. And by this time, Chinnery also had 2 more sons born to an Indian mother. Finally, his 20-year-old son, John Eustace, also came out to India, but soon died of fever.
Did Chinnery suffer from any sense of loss or guilt? Well, it's hard to say, but certainly he would have felt a stranger to his family after all those years apart. Chinnery liked to suggest that he came to China in order to escape from his wife. The real reason, as his friend William Hunter observed, was to escape from his creditors. Chinnery owed huge amounts of money in India, and it was ultimately debt that caused him to escape to the China coast. This is surely the most famous image of Macau, the facade of the great Jesuit church of St. Paul's.
When it was completed in the early 17th century, it was perhaps the most splendid church in Asia. Richly painted and gilded, the facade is covered with Christian symbols and Chinese pictograms, saints, demons, Chinese lions, and Portuguese ships. Chinnery sketched this scene before most of the church and college was burned down in January 1835. This drawing depicts the church shortly before the fire, including parts of the college on the right, and later we see he made sketches from inside the burnt-out ruins, showing the devastation.
It must have been a disastrous occasion for the whole city when this famous institution burnt to the ground, leaving little but the great facade itself.
In this image of the church, taken after the fire, we see a procession of priests, marked by their robes and billowing capes as they climb up the steps. This is the only point of view from which you get the whole facade. If you bought from George Chinnery 20 views of Macau, then this view would surely be one of them. He doesn't just draw the facade, he draws some Chinese figures which are very much part of the Chinnery drawing. And this particular drawing has got his shorthand in the corner, giving the date October the 18th, 1834. So we know it was done 3 months before the fire. The peninsula of Macau served as a sanctuary for Westerners from the time the first Portuguese were allowed to settle here in the 1550s. They fought off Chinese pirates, much to the satisfaction of the governing Chinese authorities. They built forts on the hills and installed cannon for use against the marauding Dutch and English. The forts of Macau appear in many of Chinnery's drawings, in particular Fort Monte, dominating the center of the peninsula.
There's not quite such a commanding view nowadays, but you can see the rapidly expanding townships of China across the inner harbour.
Chinnery divided his early years on the China coast between Macau and Canton, that's modern-day Guangzhou. This was the fulcrum of the trade between China and the West. Until the Opium War forced the Chinese government to open other ports to foreigners, Canton was the only Chinese city in which they were permitted to trade. In several of Chinnery's views of Canton, the principal landmarks are the Chinese river forts. The river forts were built to protect communities against pirates or hostile factions, and many of them also played a role in the Opium War.
The Canton river forts, which Chinnery painted, are all gone. But you can still see the remains of several other Ming Dynasty forts around the Pearl River Delta, all excellent sketching locations for the likes of Chinnery. In fact, his livelihood depended, in no small measure, upon the efforts of the Scottish merchants William Jardine and James Matheson.
It's clear that the two businessmen helped to pay off some of Chinnery's debts.
It was always a struggle for Chinnery, who was never entirely able to clear his debts.
Despite his interest in landscapes and clusters of people, Chinnery continued to paint portraits to make a living.
The Macau Museum has these 3 small portraits in oils, commissioned works. Thomas Beale was a local resident and friend of the artists, and the rather severe-looking British trader William Dent, and his generously sleeved wife Mary.
Now, William was a member of the Dent family who were the great trading rivals of Jardine Matheson, until the Dent firm went bankrupt. One of the artist's first patrons at Canton was the Philadelphian merchant Benjamin Chew Wilcox, a man of Chinnery's own age and temperament. He was American consul at Canton and the first American merchant to trade in opium from India.
The American merchant was a tall man, nicknamed the High Devil by the Chinese.
According to William Hunter, Mr. Wilcox of Philadelphia, like Chinnery, always wearing the high white cravat and corresponding coat collar, then so much in vogue, took to him immensely, and they became the best of friends. Here again, we see Chinnery's fondness for vermilion, not only in the face, but also in the coat lining and the watch string and the ribbon around the scroll of paper on the desk. Chinnery was often commissioned to paint the wives and families of merchants in Macau. In this painting of the Marshbanks family, the Chinese armour on the left leans outwards to keep an eye on the children. Her angled stance also has the effect of dissociating her from the members of the European family. It is they, with their raised chins and confident expressions, who are presented as the proper subjects of the portrait. The eyes of the three children are directed towards the artist, while the parents look upwards and outwards, as if preoccupied with weightier matters. Sometimes Chinnery would do a preliminary sketch in oils. Here, the mother of the children is absent for some reason, and the Chinese armour, with an arm around the elder daughter, appears at the centre of the picture. The small boy on the left wears a tartan uniform, reminding us that many of the early traders on the China coast were Scottish.
One can't talk about Chinnery's portraits of children without referring to one of his most famous and certainly his strangest portrait, that of the Kirkpatrick children, which was painted in India.
The two children, aged 4 and 3, are wearing the dress of the Hyderabad court where they lived. Their father, Colonel Kirkpatrick, was the senior British official at court and had adopted Indian customs and a young Indian wife, Khairunissa. Chinnery painted this larger-than-life portrait of the two children just before they were sent to be educated in England. A month after they left, Colonel Kirkpatrick died in Calcutta, and his 19-year-old widow, Khairunissa, travelled 1,000 miles to mourn at his grave, bringing the portrait along on the back of an elephant. She never saw her children again.
It's a sad story, but there is a happy ending of sorts. The girl in the picture, Kitty Kirkpatrick, grew up in England where she got married, and the painting, after spending several years in Calcutta, made its way back to England too. And one day, Kitty happened to see it hanging in a country house. She immediately recognized it, burst into tears, and eventually the painting was returned to its rightful owner.
When Chinnery came to Canton, it was the centre of international trade between China and the West, where fortunes were made and lost at every turn.
Of the Chinese merchants who dealt with the Westerners, the most prominent was Wu Bingjian, also known as Hao Qua.
He had interests in tea plantations and rice fields, in property and in banking, making him the richest merchant in China and perhaps in the world. Hao Qua came from a deeply cultured family. He had a famous garden, which is suggested in the background of the picture. Lu Yuanqin, also known as Mo Qua, was a very different man, perhaps a little like Chinnery himself, laid back and sociable, but inclined to be reckless in his investments. And, like Chinnery, he enjoyed his food. Each man is surrounded by Chinese symbols of status, a mandarin's cap, fine porcelain and furniture, and a spittoon on the floor. Mo Qua has a goldfish, symbol of prosperity. The figure of Mo Qua leans backward in a relaxed, almost sprawling fashion, while Hao Qua sits upright, a dignified figure whose narrow, austere face suggests that his great wealth had brought heavy responsibilities and anxieties.
These are surely two of Chinnery's finest portraits, painted just before the arrival of photography and introducing a new style of dramatic portraiture to the China coast.
This portrait of a Chinese mandarin is without any of the rich trappings of status or high office. Now here, Chinnery uses his characteristic dark background, highlighting the turquoise collar, which adds an air of distinction.
His portraits of Chinese people are not stereotypes. We do feel that they're real individuals.
In this full-length portrait of a Chinese farmer, it's as if Chinnery has just stumbled across the figure on his journeys and captured the moment the man looks up at the intruder, pipe in hand, as the sunlight falls on him and his water bucket, while the background is in shadow. Chinnery also liked capturing dilapidation, which is very much part of the notion of the picturesque aesthetic, which he learnt when he was in England. A scene that's not obviously beautiful or perfect, but full of interesting incident, with signs of everyday wear and tear. In this oil painting, depicting the old city wall below Peña Church, an old gentleman is seated against the wall. Your eye is led out to the view beyond, and there, leaning against a small wall in the middle distance, is a Chinese figure framed by the Grand Bay. shrubs growing up on the old wall, and weeds sprouting beside the path add a sense of picturesque decay.
On the other hand, this fine portrait of a Chinese woman framed in a moon gateway appears more staged.
Much of the light falls on the figure, set against dark trees and moody clouds. We admire the rich blue of her silk robe, her small shoes, and elegant fan. But a few shafts of sunlight are also allowed to fall on the water and the boats beyond her. But what of Chinnery himself? What was he like? His friend William Hunter said that when Chinnery was in good spirits,
his words and manner equaled his skill with the brush. He became a general favorite for his stories of Indian life. His powers of description and his eccentricities made him a much sought-for guest. In China, he was renowned as an enormous eater, never drinking either wine, beer, or spirits. His sole beverage was tea, often cold and hot.
Chinnery famously enjoyed his dinners, and everybody enjoyed his company. Moreover, his extrovert, flamboyant personality helped to develop the legend of Chinnery, the old China hand, who lived to an amazing age and enriched the lives of everyone around him.
it was said that nobody thought of having a dinner party without inviting Chinnery. His conversation was said to be as rich as a play, and anybody who came to Macau, who could afford it, would have their portrait done by Chinnery, or at least buy one of his sketchbooks. He became an institution of whom the community at Macau was justly proud. One of the liveliest accounts of life in Macau is the diary of Harriet Lowe, who came to Macau at the age of 20. She stayed for 4 years and was the first American woman to visit China. As for her opinion of the British, she wrote,
"All they care about is eating, drinking, and frolicking."
But Harriet did pay regular visits to Chinnery's lodging, where she took instruction from him in sketching.
I went to Chinnery the portrait painter's room yesterday. He had some fine likenesses there. He's remarkably successful. How I'd wish that I'd had a little of the needful to put into the man's hand, that he may take my beautiful phiz.
In the course of the next 3 years, Harriet came to know Chinnery well, and she did eventually have her portrait painted.
Looking at one of the ugliest men in existence. But he makes himself so agreeable that you quite forget how ugly he is.
In her portrait, Harriet appears with sloping shoulders and billowing sleeves, a fashion which had astonished her when she'd first arrived.
They bring us the latest Calcutta fashions. Such sleeves I never beheld. Complete frights.
There were further sessions during which Chinnery altered the composition by placing a book in Harriet's hands. This pleased Harriet, because the book partly masks the hands which, as often in Chinnery's portraits, are painted rather casually.
2nd of April, 1833. Went to Chinnery's this morning for my last sitting. The likeness is said to be near perfect, but I think it is a very ugly person. It has not raised my vanity in the least. I sit till near 3 till I was quite exhausted, glad to leave the studio.
I think it's a charming portrait, with her head slightly tilted, just the beginnings of a smile, and of course those extravagant sleeves with the see-through gauze. Chinnery's contemporaries said that he had one of the ugliest of faces, with deep-set eyes and heavy brows. And Harriet Lowe, in her diary, disliked some of his habits, but she made some pretty sharp remarks about his personality. He is a man
who has been a great observer of human nature. His personal appearance, I think, rather against him, being what I call fascinatingly ugly. And with a habit he has of distorting his features in a most unchristian manner. And with taking snuff, smoking, and snorting. I think were he not so agreeable, he would be intolerable.
This small self-portrait in oil, which is now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, shows Chinnery aged about 50 with a dark brown background.
I patronize light background except in very old people. With them, dark. It adds to the sobriety of age.
He likes to present himself in profile, with an easel or a sketch pad, but then turning his head to the spectator, as though pausing for a moment from his work. In this portrait, now in the Peabody Museum in Salem, a dark eye glares over the spectacles, and his eyebrow twists sharply. Signs of age appear in the fine texture of the hair and the sagging cheeks and the creases about the eyes.
This late self-portrait, which is now in the National Portrait Gallery in London, was taken in Chinnery's studio in Macau. And we can see on the easel is an Indian landscape, then above it on the wall, a view of the Praia Grande in Macau. And just to emphasize that the artist is in China, we see two porcelain cups behind him. Now, Chinnery was nearly 70 years old when he painted this portrait, and what he intended is that it should sum up his entire career in the East. So 23 years in India and 27 more years on the China coast.
Here he presents himself as the legendary curmudgeon of the China coast, with bulbous nose, heavy jowls, and lips thrust forward. Once again, we see his bold yet subtle use of the expensive pigment vermilion. He once wrote,
"For a cake of vermilion, I would willingly give 100 rupees.
And he applied it generously, especially in the shadowing under the nose.
The sheer number of Chinnery's self-portraits testifies to his vanity, perhaps, but it also suggests there was a market for them. Chinnery portrayed many of the leading figures involved in the China trade.
The physician-turned-merchant William Jardine was described by Harriet Lowe as the great man of the China coast, and he was certainly a formidable character. In this portrait, we see him seated in his office. But if you visited him there, you would not be offered a chair. Visitors had to remain standing so that business could be conducted as swiftly as possible. One of those employed by Jardine was the missionary Charles Gutzlaff, who had a genius for languages. Gutzlaff travelled along the coast as a translator on Jardine's opium ships, so that he could assist their captains on the one hand and distribute Christian tracts on the other. He also ran a network of spies gathering information for the British, including the British forces in the First Opium War. When he travelled in China, he often adopted local dress, and here Chinnery shows him in the clothing of a Fujianese sailor. And then there were the Parsees, several of whom were major players in the cotton and opium trades. The Parsees were followers of the Iranian prophet Zoroaster and become familiar figures in Canton and Macau, dressed in their long coats and their tall hats. One, by the name of Hojiboy Rustomji, was a close friend of Chinnery's in the last years of his life.
One Englishman in Macau seemed to stand out, a man who improved the eyesight of thousands of Chinese people. Dr. College set up a clinic for victims of eye disease, which treated some 4,000 sufferers. And Chinnery's painting of College in his clinic was taken to London, and it was there that Harriet Lowe saw it.
The likeness, I'm sorry to say, is not so striking as in many of Chinnery's pictures. The face is in profile, which is perhaps the reason. The figure, a full length, is perfect. One hand is resting on the forehead of a Chinawoman, whom he has restored to sight from total blindness.
Here again, Chinnery has the head of College turned to the side to give it a smarter action, as he put it. His collar is upright, and the group of figures forms this pyramid shape. Another patient is waiting in the corner, half in, half out of the room, and College is beckoning to his Chinese assistant, Ah Fun, so that Ah Fun can explain the treatment to the woman patient. In the hot summer months, many of the expatriates would spend their time on verandas to avoid the sun and catch the breeze. Or you could retreat to the gardens and the hilltops. One such place is the Camonche Gardens. In Chinnery's time, this Grotto of Camonche was a cluster of granite rocks on a hilltop, commanding a view over the inner harbour. Not much has changed. By these rocks, the Portuguese poet Luís Vaz de Camões is believed to have composed his epic poem Os Lusíadas, in the first year of Portuguese settlement. And the so-called grotto formed a part of the large gardens of a fine house, generally known as the casa.
This looks to be the place where Chinnery stood to create one of his paintings of this rock feature.
In Chinnery's day, there was a little pavilion on top where you could climb up and get a view across the water. Chinnery typically put a group of Chinese playing a game in front of the aperture, and then in the foreground you've got a family of goats and a sweeper's brush leaning on the stone bench, a typical Chinnery touch.
I think his contrasts of light and shade are a very significant part of his painting. He's always looking for fresh angles and viewpoints in order to bring a bit of extra drama and theatre to his pictures.
For a time, Chinnery had the market and a host of new subjects very much to himself.
So this was a great opportunity for an enterprising artist from Europe, such as George Chinnery. But what he can scarcely have anticipated was that this was a time of rising tension between China and the West. And this would lead to armed conflict and ultimately to the creation of the colony of Hong Kong.
In 1839, the Chinese emperor, well aware that the opium trade was damaging the economy of China, appointed an energetic and incorruptible man, Commissioner Lin Seshu, with a mandate to halt the opium trade by whatever means. Commissioner Lin required the Western merchants to surrender their cargoes of opium, which were then ceremonially thrown into pits and sluiced out into the Pearl River. But this did not bring an end to the smuggling of opium. The British now proposed to conduct their trading operations through Macau instead of Canton. Lin then put pressure on the Portuguese government to expel the British from Macau.
Chinnery's existence was not always so calm and secure. He was living in fear of his life, in abject misery, as he told James Matheson.
I should like to paint a few good pictures before I'm put to the sword. Rely on it, something dreadful is coming. I feel it is certain, and am in a state of anxiety beyond expression.
Meanwhile, the British merchants successfully lobbied their government to send a fleet of warships. In June 1840, a British naval force began to gather at the China coast, leading to a series of conflicts that became known as the First Opium War. In the context of the Opium War, Chinnery's painting On Dent's Veranda takes on a particular significance. It's a scene of pleasant, out-of-season relaxation. On the wall is a telescope and a barometer, suggesting the marine interest of the three figures. The mild sunshine illuminates the word China in the corner of a map on the wall. A light breeze is just sufficient to agitate the spiral of smoke from an incense burner on the extreme left. But there's more to this picture than meets the casual glance. The figures are the Frenchman Durand, the American William Hunter, and an English naval officer, William Hall, and all three were involved in different ways in the hostilities of 1839 to 42. This picture was painted at the conclusion of the war. Lancelot Dent is absent, so the host is his colleague Durand, who'd been a captain of a Bombay-based ship bringing opium and cotton from India to China. The middle figure is William Hunter of Kentucky, a partner in Russell and Company, which had been the largest American dealer in opium. But Hunter did not approve of the British military action, which he called one of the most unjust wars ever waged by one nation against another. The third figure on the veranda, leaning against the column, is Captain Hall of the Royal Navy, who commanded the formidable armed steamship Nemesis, the first iron-built vessel to be seen in China.
Hunter and Durand were two of Chinnery's oldest and closest friends during the last 15 years of his life, and indeed Hunter was with him at his deathbed.
But the presence of Captain Hall lends an extra dimension to the picture. It seems to express the Westerners' relief that by force of arms, their community on the China coast had been preserved. This idea is reinforced by an oversized scarlet opium poppy flourishing on Dent's veranda, a reminder that opium had been the basis of the China trade and continued to be so even after the war was over. In the course of the First Opium War, a British force took possession of Hong Kong on the 26th of January 1841. By the time that the Treaty of Nanjing was signed 18 months later, formally ending the war, a township had grown up on Hong Kong Island.
Many of the Western merchants now moved from Macau to Hong Kong, and in the winter of 1846, Chinnery himself made the 30-mile steamer voyage to the new colony. But this was his only visit to Hong Kong.
I was there 6 months only. At the time so very unwell, not to say ill, that I had the power of doing but very little.
Chinnery's drawings of Hong Kong depict a settlement whose buildings were functional rather than decorative. There were barracks, a jail, a hospital, and substantial residences for the leading officers and merchants. Development was very rapid. The Hong Kong recorded by Chinnery was not so much a community as a grandiose building site.
I think Chinnery may not have liked what he saw in Hong Kong and preferred his quieter life among his old friends in Macau. Although Chinnery was the only professional Western artist living here, he did face competition of a kind that he hadn't encountered in India. Competition from the flourishing school of Cantonese export artists.
These artists painted all kinds of subjects in a Western manner for the Westerners who came to the China coast. Favourite subjects were the factories or trading bases at Canton and other locations involved in the China trade.
But when Chinnery came to China, one Chinese artist made a point of painting in Chinnery's style, and that was Guan Chaocheng, better known to Westerners as Lam Qua.
Lam Qua developed a great facility for painting portraits in Chinnery's manner. He became a serious rival to the English artist, undercutting his prices and gaining a considerable celebrity among visitors. Lam Qua gained a reputation as a copier of Chinnery's work, although he did paint original portraits too.
It can be quite difficult to tell Chinnery's work from Lam Qua's.
At first glance, both of these portraits appear the same, and yet one is a self-portrait by Chinnery and the other is a copy by Lam Qua. Both display the Chinnery trademarks of vivid red at the lips and the corners of the eye and nose. But Chinnery's original on the right is just a little freer and bolder in the handling of the paint. He takes risks with the paint in search of dramatic effect.
Whereas Lam Qua's painting on the left is applied in a slightly smoother and sharper manner, especially in the flesh of the face and the white cravat.
Adjacent to the Commerce Gardens is a small plot of land that was purchased by the British merchants to serve as a small Protestant chapel and cemetery. Of Chinnery's contemporaries on the China coast, the most celebrated, at least among the British public, was Robert Morrison, the first Protestant missionary to China and translator of the St. James Bible into Chinese, and this chapel is named in his honour.
Robert Morrison set himself the daunting, if not impossible, task of converting the Chinese to Protestant Christianity.
Mr. Chinnery has painted a portrait of me and of 2 Chinese assistants forming a group with reference to my dictionary of the scriptures, prayer book and the college. It has been much admired, and the gentlemen of the factory have sent it home to be engraved at their expense as a token of regard and esteem for an old friend. Mr. Chinnery has taken the utmost pains with the picture and produced a painting which is, I believe, gratifying as a work of art to all who have seen it.
Unfortunately, the original painting was destroyed in a fire in London 50 years later, but a good many of the engravings survive. Robert Morrison was buried next to his first wife and an infant son here in the Protestant cemetery at Macau, which he helped to establish. This is a wonderfully evocative place, and Chinnery's is probably the most prominent memorial in the whole graveyard, taking pride of place here on the back wall and looking down on the graves of many of his friends, including the Morrison family.
Chinnery continued to make sketches with no obvious lessening of skill until the last year of his long life. He died at 4:30 in the morning on the 30th of May, 1852. His friend Dr. Watson performed an autopsy, revealing that Chinnery had died of a stroke.
If Chinnery stirred from his grave today, we're bound to wonder what he would make of all this.
I don't know if he gambled on the horses or at the tables, but he certainly took risks with his life and his career as he left his family behind and crossed the oceans to seek his fortune. However, if he hadn't been a risk-taker in his life and perhaps also in his art, he would never have come to China or left us the extraordinary body of drawings and paintings that so vividly bring us back to Macau and the China coast of 2 centuries ago.